Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is talk about Alvin Plantinga's ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, this is a really interesting argument. Hopefully you will find this interesting and learn something from it. And even though it's called an ontological argument, it is very different from the ones like St Anselm's, which actually rests on Platonic metaphysics. So we'll talk about that in another video, but this one is a little bit different, where this one, what this relies on is the idea of possible worlds, which kind of involves modal logic. So I'm going to do the best I can to not butcher this in a few minutes to try to give you a quick overview of possible worlds so you can understand the way this argument works. So a possible world is just basically captures the idea that there are some things that could possibly be true or could have been, even though they're not true in our world. And the way we kind of abstract this or we think about this is we consider basically a set of propositions. So I'm going to just use it as an example, P and Q and R and S. And each possible world is one where some of those propositions are true and other ones are false. So maybe one world is P, Q, R, and S are all true. Then another world is Q, R, and S are true, but P is not true. You know, another world, P and Q are not true, but R and S are true. And you can think of, these different combinations. Now, there are some propositions that cannot be true in any possible world. And one example is the prime minister is a prime number. Now, the reason this can't be true in any world is the prime minister refers to a person and a prime number refers to an abstract number object. So these cannot be true. That's a category error. They just cannot be true in any possible world. And similarly, the idea of Ben being a married bachelor, that can't be true in any possible world either. It's just kind of nonsense. You can't have contradictions, things that are true and not true at the same time. So that's a proposition in which that cannot be true in any possible world. But there are some propositions that could possibly be true, even though they're not true in our actual world. And this gets to the idea of possible worlds. So the proposition Billie Eilish is the president of the United States is not true in the actual world, at least not yet. It's not true in our world, but it could possibly be true. So we say Billie Eilish is the president of the United States in a possible world. That proposition, if we imagine a world where Billie Eilish is the president of the United States, that proposition would be true in that particular world. And you could, of course, imagine, other things being true or false in that world as well. What that brings us to is that there are some propositions that have to be true or have to be false in all worlds, such as, the ones that we gave above. And these are called either necessary propositions, the ones that are true in all possible worlds, or impossible propositions if they're false in all possible worlds. Similarly, some can be true and false in some worlds, and these are what we call contingent propositions. Contingent propositions are propositions that are true in some worlds and false in others. So Billie Eilish being the president of the United States is a contingent proposition. It's not true in the actual world, but it's possibly true, or it would be true in a possible world. Those are kind of two ways of saying the same thing. And then we have, of course, propositions that are true in at least one possible world. These are called possible propositions. And we'll need this distinction later, but just think about the idea that there's some things that could possibly be true and some things, no matter what, they cannot be true. That's really what the distinction we're trying to make here. Now let's move on to Plantinga's argument now that we hopefully get an idea of this. Plantinga's argument goes like this, and this is William Lane Craig's formation, which is very similar to Plantinga's formulation. Premise 1, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. It means it's a possible proposition that a maximally great being exists. Premise 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Basically, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, it would be better if this maximally great being existed in more worlds, and it would be the greatest if it existed in all possible worlds. Premise 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world, because the actual world is one of all the possible worlds, and if it exists in every possible world, it's going to exist in this particular actual world. And of course, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists, period. And the conclusion, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Now, this is, of course, the way you would reason your way to God being, of course, a maximally great being, or the greatest being. But let's pick this apart, take a few notes on this. Premises 2 through 5 are relatively uncontroversial. Really, the only controversial premise here is it is possible that a great being exists. So basically, what this argument tries to do is say that if God exists possibly, then he must exist necessarily in all possible worlds. And I think going from possibility to necessity, that's the part that's relatively uncontroversial. The controversial part, or where people would probably disagree, therefore, is whether or not a maximally great being possibly exists. Now, does this mean, of course, agnostics who don't take a stand one way or another should become theists? Well, let's be careful here and not equivocate the word agnostic. One could be agnostic about whether or not a maximally great being exists, possibly. But if you accept that it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then it seems that a maximally great being would have to exist in all worlds, including our own. But I think the fact that we can at least think of this is a good reason to at least, a priori consider it. We can't imagine what a married bachelor would look like. That's just ridiculous. But we can, of course, imagine a maximally great being. Of course, we can imagine things that eventually turn into contradictions, of course. So that's not, it's not the strongest argument here. But I think, we should at least take it seriously, is my point here, because that's not necessarily a good reason to not consider it. Just the fact that it doesn't seem to lead to any contradictions. Or if there are, of course, somebody would need to acclaim what the problem is. If they're saying, well, it's not possible that a maximally great being exists, well, they would need to show where it's not possible or how it's not possible, these sorts of things. And then the primary objection that you see, and I'm not really trying to defend this argument as much as help you understand it, so that's why I'm going to address this particular objection you hear about, well, wouldn't a perfect lion exist? A maximally great lion also exists in all possible worlds, or a perfect island exists in all possible worlds. It's better if it would exist. Can't we just, maximally great it into existence? The thing I want to say about this is a necessarily existent lion, or a perfect lion that exists in all worlds, doesn't become a lion in most cases, right? So for instance, in a world where the universe is just a singularity of infinite space-time curvature, temperature, and density, this is not what we consider a mere lion. Things that are not made out of like any matter, or things where no matter, universes where there were no matter created at all. You can imagine just, all these different multiverses and stuff. It's a little kind of related to that idea, but not exactly. You could, of course, say, well, that's not a lion. You're talking about something that just acts like a lion or whatever. But that's you're basically describing God at that point, right? If it just necessarily exists no matter what, that's what you get. And then the other thing I would say too is islands and lions, these are contingent on things like matter. Islands are, in our view, are contingent on things like water and land and these sorts of things in ways that God is not, in ways that, for instance, God being, in some ways, being itself as maximally great being, that's a different sort of thing. So what I would say, the person proposing this as an objection, to think outside the box and remember that God is, this like ultimate thing, not just, for instance, an island or a person or something that rests contingently. It is like necessity, not contingency. So that's one way to try to get around that objection. But it's an interesting argument. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. You can read more about it, of course, from Plantinga and Craig and other people who have talked about this. But it's a fun argument. It's interesting. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you think it's possible that a maximally great being exists, and what you think of this argument. All right. I will see you in the next video.